Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody African. Now, before we get to today's topic, which is from 1871, I wanted to just mark a very interesting day here in 2020. So yesterday, Monday, December 14th, we had 2 major stories. We had the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine, and we had the Electoral College vote, which made it very clear that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. We've talked a few times on this show about these days where 2 or more huge stories kind of collide, and I think that in future seasons of a show like this, they may look back at Monday, December 14th, 2020 as one of those kinds of days. So I just wanted to acknowledge it. But today on this show, we are talking about December 15th, 1871, the day that Boss Tweed is arrested by Sheriff Matthew Brennan to face 120 counts of grand larceny, forgery, false pretenses, conspiracy, and other felonies and misdemeanors. Boss Tweed was thrown in jail. He was initially denied bail, but a former Tweed protege, a judge, George Barnard, granted him that bail of $5,000, and Boss Tweed walked out. And this was kind of the beginning of a pattern, I would say, for Boss Tweed over the next 10 years or so. He was, safe to say, the most powerful person in New York politics for much of the 1860s, controlling both the money and the votes for the famously corrupt Tammany Hall system. But then in the next decade, over the 1870s, he's still powerful, but he kind of spends a lot of the time getting arrested, getting out on bail, escaping at one point, awaiting trial. You kind of start to lose track of what he's up to, but his power is fading. He is being held to account, and things are turning for Boss Tweed. So we will try and get our head around this moment, the subject of today's show, this arrest that really marked a pivotal moment for Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. And here to do that is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
I wanted, in this moment right here, to have some line about Boss Tweed's connections to Columbia. And I Googled, and there wasn't, which is surprising to me because, you know, as we will discuss, the story of Boss Tweed is he had his hands in everything, and you can kind of like look at any notable project in New York City, and in that era, Boss Tweed was the puppet master of sorts, but I could not find, in my 30 seconds of Googling before we started taping, I could not find a concrete connection between Boss Tweed and Columbia, so you were off the hook.
All right, well, that's really disappointing, but I did see that Judge George Barnard was the one who granted him a bail of $5,000, so maybe there's a Barnard connection in there somewhere. We can get in the back door that way.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, where do you want to start? Because as I said, you know, there's this moment where you can look back at the previous decade at Boss Tweed's power, or you can look forward at the erosion of that power.
Let's start with the power, so that we can see how the mighty fall. Mm-hmm. You know, here's Boss Tweed. He's somebody who came up. His name is not Boss, it's William. And when he was but a lowly William Tweed, he joined the fire department in New York. And he was too corrupt for the fire department, but all of that corruption and all of that toughness, I think the thing that he really got in trouble for was he liked to beat people up. That drew the attention of the Democratic Party. Draw from that what you will about the Democratic Party at the time. Yeah. And they brought him into the system, and he would claw his way up to the very top of Tammany Hall and sort of rule there for, as you mentioned, well over a decade.
Yeah, so that I think is one of the fundamental things I'm trying to get my head around with his story is how much is he an alpha who takes the world and bends it to his will, and how much was he just kind of right person, right place, right time, and plugged into a system as you described?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, I mean, there is something about Boss Tweed that makes him stand out. In memory, he was himself kind of larger than life. Physically, he was memorialized in these political cartoons, and so he has this staying power in the American imagination. But in many ways, he was part of this city-based machine politics that we see across the United States. And in this case, in New York, right, is a city that is starting to get a huge influx of immigrants. It doesn't have any sort of social safety net to speak of. And these machines, even though they were super corrupt, were able to get new immigrants jobs. They were able to get them housing. They were able to do constituent services. And all that these new migrants had to do in response was vote many times for Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall.
Right. And we actually touched on this a little bit when we did an episode about a judge who was part of the sort of Tammany Hall system who went missing. But yeah, the good side of corruption and machine politics is that it gets stuff done, but it obviously also picks winners and losers and is very fickle and is often there to line the pockets of the powerful as well.
Right. And it's incredibly wasteful, too. I mean, there's all of this money that's flowing into New York City government, but it's flowing out not into city services, not into institutions, but into the pockets of Boss Tweed and his cronies. And so, on the one hand, you can say, well, they were providing these vital bridge services that weren't being provided otherwise. And on the other hand, you're like, but it was so inefficient. And that's why these good government types pop up in the aftermath of all of this, because they're like, what if we could do all of this but not be corrupting all of these people in politics?
And as we look at the way that Boss Tweed accrued so much power, it's the story of how power often operates in this country, and it has, I think, echoes for today, certainly. But, the focus of the Tammany Hall project seemed to be pretty straightforward. It was, build financial connections, manipulate and contest votes, and work the refs in terms of the judicial system. And, we are still continuing to see those things today. But I mean, it's just a nice sort of tidy lesson in where the actual power is.
Yeah, and how people understand power works and what people are willing to overlook. And so the corruption of Boss Tweed was not unknown. It was something that was happening more or less in plain sight. It's not that people didn't know that he was to a certain extent corrupt, but they didn't care as long as he was still delivering for them. And I think that sort of blatant corruption, it sometimes seems really confusing to us today, even as we watch the same kinds of things unfold. But it's that transactional nature of politics that I think we sometimes lose touch of, but is incredibly powerful and gets a lot of people to vote for you.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, that's right. I think just the era we're talking about in this podcast and the era we're living in right now is just one where the veil has dropped a little bit on the transactional nature of politics. It has always been transactional. It's like a really important reminder to realize that these are just like people, often men, who get in rooms together and they just sort of work it out. And we all then have to live with that.
Well, and what's kind of amazing about it is that the screw turns, which is to say that like there actually were consequences for it, which is not necessarily what you would expect in an era of powerful machine politics.
Yeah, and hold that thought, because I do want to ask one other thing that just is interesting to me here. We think of the Boss Tweed era and it reshaped New York, and we talk about a lot of the projects that certainly the things you mentioned in terms of government services and integrating immigrants into this city, and there were all lots of public work services that were wrapped up in this corruption, bridges and roads and new buildings and all sorts of stuff. And we think of it as this big transformative era, which it was. The thing that strikes me when you look back at it, it's like 1864 to 1869, right? Like it's really, it's pretty fast. Like it's just a few short years. And Boss Tweed like has this sort of rockets up into power, and then pretty quickly the screw starts to turn. So, another reminder that a lot of this stuff can happen really, really quickly.
And I think, I don't know how other people are, but I tend to think of Boss Tweed as somebody who, again, like this larger than life figure, it feels like he was around forever. And I don't often think of him like in relation to the Civil War, but of course, like for the first half of the 1860s, that's what the country was focused on. And there's this like existential crisis over whether the country will even continue to exist in the same form. But because his politics are very local, that's where his story is taking place against that backdrop.
Yeah, but he's not Robert Moses, right? Who was legit around with his finger on the thumb of transforming New York for 50 years. He has this flash of moment and power and transformation.
Robert Caro could still get a good 700 pages out of this,
Oh,
though.
I'm sure, yes. And we'll get another 4, 5, 6 minutes or so. But as the screw turns, as you put it, one specific thing, to come back to this moment when he gets arrested, things had started to turn for Boss Tweed in the year of 1871, and he kind of reads the tea leaves and says, I think I'm going to get out of town a little bit. And my favorite tidbit of this whole story is that he gets arrested because he comes back to New York City. I think he was in Connecticut. And he comes back to New York City because he cannot, according to some of the reports at the time, he cannot resist wanting to see the Christmas lights as they go up in New York and maybe do some window shopping, or, I don't know if they had the tree at Rockefeller Center at the moment. I don't think there was a Rockefeller Center at the moment. But, I just love this idea that, that he cannot resist coming back, and then they nab him.
Look, Jody, New York City at Christmas time is a wondrous place.
Yes. Yeah. He probably had a couple deals that he wanted to cut, a couple.
He might have had a few other things he was doing in New York at the time.
Yeah. But the lead up to this is very interesting because it is this incredible mix of still accruing power and losing power. Because if I read this correctly, he wins an election in November of 1871, and then he gets arrested the next month.
Yes. So he had actually already been arrested once before, got out, was trying to decide what to do. He runs for re-election. He wins this state Senate seat, but he doesn't bring with him all of these other members of Tammany Hall. So he doesn't have the same kind of power. So no sooner has he won this election, there aren't any Tammany Hall people there with him. And so it's very easy to continue to prosecute him for his corruption and vote buying and embezzlement and all of these things. And so, yes, he goes back into jail. I mean, I think that, we still need to explain why so many people turned against Tammany at this point. So let's talk a little bit about that. But this is definitely a moment where you kind of don't know what's going to happen. I mean, he's popular enough to win an election, not popular enough to stay out of prison.
And when you think about the kind of power that he accrued, another really interesting thing to me is he was an elected official of sorts. He was a New York State senator. He would run for office. But, you don't get the sense that it was his elected positions that were really where he was accruing power and really had the most influence. It was really just his being a behind-the-scenes wheeler and dealer. And so I think, again, tells us a lot about power. It's not just who's actually been elected.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about the goods he had available to dole out as part of the reason why him being a politician was important, that he could give these patronage jobs, that he had contracts to give out, things like that. But yeah, all of this was happening over building contracts and those kinds of behind-the-scenes things that were not specifically related to, say, like passing policy.
Yeah, and I think, again, I think there are people who want to have power and want to cut deals, and sometimes when they find themselves in elected office, it ends up being a little constricting to them, and you realize that the real sort of flexibility and power is at that level just below actually being in office, right?
Right, because if you're at that level just below, you might be able to escape having powerful political enemies who can, in fact, prosecute you. Right,
or being accountable to elections.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about why things start to turn for him. What are the forces that come into play that start to undercut the power of Tammany Hall?
So I think there's at least two things we want to point to. One is this cartoonist, Thomas Nast, one of the most famous political cartoonists of the 19th century. He really went on a crusade against Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall to point out their corruption. And this was really important because remember that a good chunk of the New York City electorate would not have been literate. Literacy was not something that was particularly widespread, especially among new immigrants, at least literacy in English. But these pictures, right, were easily legible. And that's why political cartoons were so powerful in this era, is that you could get across a message without necessarily using a lot of words. So Thomas Nast's crusade against Tweed was really important. And then there's this event in 1871 in the summer where there's a parade that happens where Irish Protestants hold this parade and a riot breaks out and 60 people are killed. Catholics are targeted, and Catholics were a big part of Tammany Hall's base. And here they felt like Tweed and Tammany Hall hadn't protected them. They'd wanted this parade canceled. It wasn't canceled, and a bunch of people were hurt and killed. And so there was a sense that this government that they had put in place wasn't doing enough for them. And that combination of factors, I think, helped kneecap Tammany Hall just at this moment that Boss Tweed needed them.
Yeah. And so does that just give license for the judicial system to go after someone just because, the shine is off on someone a little bit more? They feel a little less threatened?
They feel less threatened. They're not being actively blocked. You might have, in this case, prosecutors put into place who are no longer beholden to Tammany Hall. And once you have that shift in climate, it really can free up prosecutors who are part of the political system to act in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, this gets at something I think about all the time, which is we're all actors within a political climate, right? And I think sometimes you want to say there are laws and you either are on one side of the law or the other, but as we've learned and we've seen and we've talked about on this show, it is so much about the context and the particular context. And, elections are almost weirdly about putting people in place, but they're also just these clarifying moments that tell you, okay, the wind has shifted, or in this case, a narrative in the media shifts, or there's a single event that serves as a galvanizing moment and it's just kind of shifts the climate. As much as it is a sort of actual event that has tangible effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a snapshot of public opinion in many ways. And, we all love to think about the law and judges and all of these things as objective, and they're just not. This is a reminder that that is the case.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about what happens to someone as they start to lose power. What does this next decade look like for Boss Tweed? He does not, stick his hands up and let himself get cuffed and disappear from the limelight. He fights. What does that look like, and what does that teach us?
Well, look, it's actually quite an amazing story, and it's a wonder that we don't have more movies about Boss Tweed's last decade. He's arrested. In 1874, he's found guilty of embezzling millions and millions of dollars. He gets a 12-year sentence. He's freed after a year, immediately gets rearrested and faces civil charges. He's put into jail, and he's given a $3 million bail, which he just doesn't have the money to bail himself out. But he gets home visits. What is the point of having a cash bail system if you're just going to let somebody go home? Well, as he goes home, he actually escapes to Spain and is on the lam for a while.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think he's in the gangs of New York a little bit, but that later chapter of his life doesn't get as much of a role in the public imagination as maybe it should.
I mean, the guy is extradited to the United States, and he's brought back, and he's put in prison again. He dies in 1978. This is a good story that should definitely, it should be a movie.
Yeah. And he is, I will say, buried in Greenwood Cemetery, which is not far from my house, somewhere I go very often to just go for walks, and I have walked past Boss Tweed's grave there. So
is it like a big ornate deal? What is it like?
Sort of. It's if I recall, it's a bit of a family plot, and then there's some, but there is some stuff in that cemetery that's way over the top. I think this is it's not a super small headstone, but there's a bit of a monument, but it's not massive and over. He would probably be disappointed. Let me put it that way.
Fair.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we got him to his grave.
Yes, we got him to his grave. We literally did that.
As far as the story goes.
Yeah, great. Okay, well then we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And that's the end of the show. Now, very quickly, I want to acknowledge one other on this day as we wrap up. December 14th, actually yesterday, was the anniversary of the time that an Iraqi journalist threw two shoes at George W. Bush in 2008. I can't believe we didn't jump on that to do it, but there is always next year and the year after that and the year after that. So stay tuned. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. And that phrase I used in there, listener-supported, it is true. Listener support is a big puzzle piece in how we are able to make this show happen. So if you would like to support us directly or support the work of Radiotopia in general, you can do so. There's a forum on our website, thisdaypod.com. Thank you to everyone who is in a position to support and has done so. Thank you to everyone who has done their part by just spreading the word about this show. We really appreciate it. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Get in touch with any questions or comments about the show. You can email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com, or find a contact form at thisdaypod.com. You can also find us on social media at thisdaypod. Are you picking up on a theme here? Everything is This Day Pod. Okay, we'll be back on Thursday with a new show, a very exciting special guest, one that means a lot to me in particular. So that's coming your way on Thursday. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.
From